What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to the channel. I've noticed that there's been a fair bit of discussion lately about how you should cue the torso in a squat. Like, for example, whether you should cue people to be a little bit more stacked so they can maximize their bracing ability, or this other camp that's saying you should actually try to extend your spine, because when you're squatting heavier weights, the weight is trying to push you into flexion, and so that extending your spine and trying to maintain that throughout the lift is the best way to achieve that goal. I think this is creating some confusion for lifters because there's really successful squatters that are on either side of this debate. Whereas I think where there's a lot more common ground is in what people want to see in a squat and what we think the technical model for an effective squat should be. And I think that how you achieve that or how you cue that is highly individual. And so if we just unpack some common KPIs or what we actually want to see in a squat, then I think we can work out how we should cue each individual based off that and get a little bit more effective of a result. As always, if you're looking to learn from me or you want to get coaching from me, just check out the notes in the description and there's links for both of those things. Anyway, let's dive into the video. Now, despite the fact that we have these seemingly opposing cueing strategies to achieve the ideal squat position, where I think that there's a lot of common ground between all coaches is in what we want to see from a squat. We want to see an isometric or relatively static torso position, and then we want to see most of the movement coming from the hips, knees, and ankles, achieving a nice vertical translation of the pelvis. Even just as I reflect on my own personal experience with different cues, like more of a stacked posture or more of an extended posture when squatting, this is something that can change for you as an individual over time as well, as your body changes, as your physical qualities change, or even just as your squat intent changes. Like, from my experience, that real extended posture, it never really clicked with my squatting. So I started to adopt a little bit more of a stacked posture, and that's what I was cueing as well. But then over time, I noticed that I sort of took it a little bit too far, and then I had to dial it back myself. I've also talked to other powerlifters and Olympic weightlifters who've been through a similar sort of journey with their squats. But anyway, let's start to break it down, why people might like either one of these cues, and then also how, if it's applied to the wrong person at the wrong time, what sort of errors that can show up as in your squat. The issues that I ran into by just extending my spine as hard as possible when I was squatting is, I've actually got a fair bit of mobility through my trunk, and I was getting into a ridiculous amount of extension. I was able to go into so much extension that it was almost impossible to maintain that throughout the squat, because I would run out of hip flexion super early in the squat, and then everything would just start to tuck under. So if you are someone who's quite mobile through your trunk, you might have a similar experience where, in theory, you're extending your spine to try to minimize movement throughout the squat, but then you've extended yourself so far that you can't actually perform a deep squat in that position, so you have no choice but to roll your hips under, and you almost get this exaggerated butt wing, despite the fact that you're trying to bend your spine the opposite direction the whole time. Often when people go into a lot of spinal extension as well, it'll sort of push their center of mass forward. Right? So I sort of notice if I flex my spine, everything goes backwards. If I extend my spine, things start to get shoved forward. As someone who has always had really tight calves and struggled with their ankle mobility, even with a bit of heel elevation, when I extended my spine that much, it was just really, really hard for me to get my knees forward. Versus being in a more flexed posture, I could actually get my knees to push over my toes because I was a little bit more counterbalanced, a little bit more stacked, and keeping the torso back allowed me to get my knees forward and keep them forward. Whereas when I extended my spine as hard as I could, again, could never get the knees forward, and they would shoot back as well when I emphasized that spinal extension. And then also, just from like a bracing or even like a sensory perspective, I always just felt my back getting worked so bloody hard from squats, and I could never really feel any tension in my abs. And like I said, like the squat, it's not just about having this awesome sensory experience. It doesn't matter if you feel your back working a little bit, but it was just one of those things where I was like, man, like squats just feel like a back exercise for me when I fully extend my spine. And just by not having my spine in as exaggerated of an extended position, a little bit less extension, I guess a little bit more flexion, I could actually maintain that position a lot more effectively throughout the squat. I mean, you'll see when I get up to my heavier sets today, it's still something that I struggle with a little bit in the squat. Just my pelvis will tilt around a little bit, but it's a lot less pronounced since I stopped overextending my spine. All right, now let's talk about cueing maximal spinal extension and how that can actually be really useful for some people when they're squatting, make their squats feel amazing. Typically, the people who respond the best to this cue are the people who have a lot less mobility in their spine. So for them, maximal trunk extension just looks like this. You know, they've got a nice amount of lumbar lordosis, maybe they've managed to flatten out their thoracic spine as well, but they can't get into this really arched position. And so these stiffer lifters, they can extend their spine as hard as possible, and they're not gonna get into this exaggerated position that's gonna be basically impossible to maintain throughout the whole range of motion of a really heavy maximal squat. If you're someone who can contract all your back muscles as hard as possible and you only get into this amount of spinal extension, then cueing spinal extension is probably going to be an awesome cue that still allows you to get forward knee travel. You feel really tight throughout your trunk and most of the movement comes from the lower body instead of your pelvis just rolling under into flexion or even your upper back going into flexion. And there's definitely some people in the stacked camp who, criticize this cue of opening up and extending the spine and how that's terrible for your bracing, but I think these people probably overestimate the strength of the diaphragm and the anterior core muscles, and they underestimate the strength of the erectors and things like that. Like if you have a big strong back and it can handle doing a lot of work for you, fuck your bracing, it doesn't mean shit. I think a lot of people over-exaggerate how this stacking cue improves your ability to brace. I think you're just sort of emphasizing different muscles. So when you're more stacked, you're using your abs to create a little bit more stability and tension in the trunk. When you're extending, you're just relying on things like your spinal erectors a little bit more to carry the work or to create that stability or tension for you. It's not better or worse, they're just different strategies that work for different people with different limb lengths and different physical qualities, or maybe different tolerances for certain muscle groups and their work capacity as well. Also, on the topic of bracing, please don't get psyoped into doing entire cycles of beltless work. It will not do shit for your bracing. You won't detrain your core muscles if you use a belt all the time. All you're doing when you run a beltless cycle, you're just lifting less weight. And sometimes that can be valid, but yeah, beltless work is, like I said, it's just a load management thing. It's not like a technique thing or it's not like a magic thing for your bracing. Let's see how fucking stacked I can stay. If you are one of those lifters as well that struggles with too much extension in your squat, I think the other thing you need to try to embrace is a little bit more forward lean in your squats. A lot of people will open up just because they've tried to stay too upright when they're squatting. Chitch, I think, has squatted a national record in his weight class drug test. Are you a national record holder or not quite?
Yes, I am.
What did you squat and what body weight?
It was 260 at 74.3.
And so when you're squatting, do you think about like stacking or do you think about extending your spine more?
I think about stacking.
Okay, so there we have it. There's one in the stacked camp. I wasn't meant to squat today, but I just didn't want to be doing RDLs while I chatted about this topic, so sorry about the average squat performance. Okay, so just to summarize, there's more than one way to cue a squat. And there's definitely more than one right way to cue a squat, and a lot of it comes down to the individual. And this isn't just a lesson for squats, this is a lesson for cueing everything, okay? You're always gonna have a technical gold standard in your head, and you're gonna run into lifters who make errors on either side. So it's not just gonna be one cue that fixes everyone up. After helping a lot of people with their squats, again, I find that typically it's the stiffer people who can't achieve that much extension who respond better to just extending as hard as they can throughout the squat. Those more mobile lifters, or particularly if you're more mobile through the spine and you actually can get into a ton of extension, then cueing a little bit more of a stack is probably going to be a little bit more useful for you. So while there may be universal things that we want everyone to demonstrate when they are squatting, the process we use to cue that can be completely opposing for different individuals. If you want to learn a more individualized approach to human movement or biomechanics, check out GPP Level 1. If you want coaching from me, I have a few spots on the roster. Click the link to apply down below. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next video.